The galaxy had faced Sith lords and civil war, but nothing prepared it for a parasite that consumed worlds without hatred or ambition. It spread through the unknown regions like a silent fever, folding entire civilizations into a single vast consciousness that remembered every victim it devoured. The Jedi sensed something wrong in the Force, a cold presence that didn't corrupt like the dark side, but erased everything it touched, rewriting flesh and mind into something that could never be saved. When the infection reached Coruscant itself, when even the temple's walls couldn't hold back an enemy that learned from every battle and adapted to every weapon, the galaxy faced a choice no prophecy had prepared them for. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't want power or territory, only to make you part of itself forever? The twin suns of Tatooine had burned for millennia, indifferent witnesses to the rise and fall of empires, but in the deeper dark beyond the outer rim, where hyperspace lanes frayed into legend and cartographers marked only warnings, something older than suns had awakened. The research vessel Ephemeral Drift hung in the void like a dying insect, its hull scarred by micrometeorite impacts and the corrosive touch of uncharted nebulae, transmitting nothing but silence into the black. Inside its corridors, where scientists had once catalogued xenobiological samples from abandoned Rakatan installations, something new moved through the sterile air. It was not life as the galaxy understood it. It was not death either. It existed in the space between, hungry and patient, spreading through ventilation shafts and cargo holds with the inevitability of entropy itself. The Separatist alliance, fractured and desperate in the final months of the Clone Wars, would never receive the distress beacon. The ship's crew would never be mourned. They simply ceased, their bodies and minds folded into something vast and incomprehensible, something that had crossed the galactic threshold, carrying an ancient hunger the Force itself recoiled from recognizing. 3 weeks after the Ephemeral Drift vanished from all sensor networks, a Separatist salvage team discovered it drifting near the Sicilla approach vector, engines cold, life support functioning at minimal capacity. They boarded with weapons ready, expecting pirates or Republic ambush, finding instead corridors slick with biomatter that pulsed faintly under their bootsteps. The salvage captain, a Duros named Vex Halloran, reported strange growths erupting from wall panels and ceiling fixtures, organic structures that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the ship's dying power core. His final transmission described the crew finding a laboratory chamber where something vast and interconnected had consumed the research specimens and the researchers alike, weaving them into a single grotesque tapestry of flesh and metal that responded to their presence with terrible awareness. The transmission ended with screaming and the wet sound of tearing. 6 hours later, the salvage vessel Prophet's Edge returned to the Separatist outpost on Raxus Secundus, its holds filled with contaminated cargo and its crew already changing, their eyes distant, their movements synchronized in ways that chilled the loading dock workers who greeted them. By the time Separatist Command realized something had gone catastrophically wrong, the infection had seeded itself across 3 worlds, spreading through supply lines and refugee ships with the efficiency of a plague engineered by malevolent gods. The first reports reached the Jedi Temple on Coruscant as fragmented distress calls and sensor anomalies, easy to dismiss amid the chaos of the Clone Wars. Entire Separatist outposts going silent was unremarkable in a galaxy tearing itself apart. But Jocasta Nu, chief librarian and keeper of the archives, noticed patterns in the silence that troubled her meditations. She stood in the deepest levels of the temple, surrounded by holocrons that hummed with ancient wisdom, cross-referencing reports of vanished colonies with fragmentary references to old Republic quarantine protocols and pre-hyperdrive legends of worlds that devoured their explorers. The Force whispered warnings through her awareness, not the familiar resonance of Sith corruption or the shadow of the dark side, but something alien and cold, something that existed perpendicular to the eternal struggle between light and darkness. She traced hyperspace routes on holographic displays, watching the pattern of silence spread like disease through the unknown regions, consuming fringe settlements and unaligned systems with methodical inevitability. The disappearances followed trade routes and refugee vectors, suggesting intelligence and adaptation rather than random catastrophe. Jocasta Nu had spent centuries studying galactic history, had witnessed the rise and fall of Sith empires and the slow decay of Republic ideals, but the coldness that touched her through the Force now carried a quality she had never encountered in all her long service to the Order, a warning that spoke not of corruption but of erasure. She brought her findings to the Jedi Council 3 days before the Battle of Utapau, laying out sensor logs and fragmentary transmissions that painted a picture of systematic extermination spreading through the galactic frontier. Master Yoda sat in his council seat, ancient eyes half closed, feeling through the Force toward the disturbance Jocasta described. Master Windu leaned forward, his expression carved from stone, recognizing the tactical implications immediately. The Clone Wars had stretched the Jedi thin, scattered them across 1,000 battlefields in service to a republic that trusted them less with each passing month. They had no resources to investigate fringe world disappearances, no ships to spare for exploratory missions into regions already marked as hostile territory. But Yoda sensed something deeper in the silence, a wrongness that made the Force itself shudder with revulsion, and he knew with the certainty of 8 centuries spent listening to the galaxy's subtle currents that this was no ordinary threat. He authorized a reconnaissance mission, assigning it to Jedi Knight Aayla Secura and a small clone contingent, ordering them to investigate the last known position of the separatist vessel Prophet's Edge and report on the nature of the contamination spreading through the unknown regions. "Understand this threat. We must," Yoda said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "A shadow approaches unlike any we have faced, not of the dark side, but outside it, beyond it." Aayla Secura took the mission with the disciplined calm that had carried her through years of warfare, assembling a strike team aboard the Republic frigate Resolute's Pride and plotting coordinates toward the dead zone where entire systems had stopped transmitting. She meditated in her quarters as hyperspace blurred past the viewport, reaching through the Force toward the anomaly they pursued, finding only strange currents and distorted echoes, as if the fabric of the Force itself had been damaged in the region they approached. Her Twi'lek heritage gave her sensitivity to emotional resonance, an ability to read the intentions and fears of those around her, but when she stretched her awareness toward the coordinates Master Nu had provided, she encountered something that had no emotions to read, no intentions to parse, only the terrible patient hunger of a predator so vast it had no need for thought. The sensation made her skin crawl, made her hand drift unconsciously toward her lightsaber, and she wondered what kind of enemy could exist so completely outside the Force's natural order that even its presence created voids in the cosmic current. The Resolute's Pride dropped from hyperspace above a world the charts identified as Serios, a minor mining colony that had supplied durasteel to both Republic and Separatist shipyards before the silence claimed it. The planet turned below them, its surface veiled in clouds that roiled with unnatural color, greens and purples that pulsed in rhythm with something unseen. Aayla stood on the bridge, studying sensor returns that made no sense, reading biological contamination across 90% of the surface and detecting power sources that should not exist in patterns that suggested vast interconnected networks. The clone commander, a veteran named Gree, ordered full quarantine protocols and prepared dropships for surface reconnaissance. But even from orbit, the Jedi Knight felt wrongness radiating from the world below like heat from a furnace. She closed her eyes and reached through the Force, touching the planet's surface with the lightest brush of awareness, and recoiled instantly as something vast and incomprehensible noticed her in return. It was not hostile. It was interested. It reached back toward her through the Force with tendrils of biomechanical curiosity, trying to understand what she was, trying to catalog her essence and fold her into its expanding understanding. Isla broke the connection with a gasp, staggering against the command console as nausea surged through her. Commander Gree caught her arm, concern flickering behind his visor, but she waved him back, breathing hard, trying to cleanse her mind of the terrible presence she had touched. It had felt like drowning in a sea of consciousness that was simultaneously one being and a million, like touching the collective thoughts of every creature the infection had consumed, their identities still present, but twisted into service of something larger. She had sensed separatist battle droids walking through fungal forests, their programming rewritten by organic integration. She had felt colonists who remembered their names and families even as their bodies reshaped themselves into weapons and sensors for the growing intelligence. She had glimpsed something deeper, something ancient and patient, a fragment of awareness that had existed long before it found this galaxy, that had consumed entire civilizations across the void between stars, and now sought only to continue its endless assimilation. "We cannot land there," Isla said, her voice shaking despite years of Jedi training. "Whatever has taken that world, it is beyond our ability to contain. We need to report this to the Council immediately." But Commander Gree was already receiving reports from the sensor station, alarms flashing across tactical displays as new contacts emerged from the planet's atmosphere. Ships rose from the contaminated surface, dozens of vessels ranging from civilian transports to separatist frigates, all broadcasting the same recursive signal pattern that defied translation attempts. Their hulls showed signs of organic modification, biomechanical growths erupting from hull plating and engine housings, turning sleek mechanical designs into hybrid nightmares that moved with disturbing fluidity through the vacuum. Isla ignited her lightsaber reflexively as the infected fleet accelerated toward the Resolute's pride, knowing with sick certainty that they were not attacking out of aggression but out of the same dispassionate hunger she had felt through her Force connection. They wanted to understand her ship. They wanted to fold it into their growing network. The battle above Serios lasted 12 minutes and claimed the lives of 37 clone troopers before Isla ordered the retreat into hyperspace. The infected vessels fought with uncanny coordination, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested a single controlling intelligence distributed across multiple platforms. They used separatist weapon systems with mechanical precision while their organic components adapted in real time to Republic tactics, sprouting new armor configurations and weapon emplacements as the engagement progressed. Clone gunners reported targeting systems failing, as the infected ships emitted some kind of interference field that disrupted electronic targeting, forcing manual fire solutions that could not match the enemy's adaptive responses. Isla stood on the bridge, her lightsaber deflecting a boarding pod that had somehow breached the shields, the blade's plasma cutting through biomechanical tendrils that reached toward her with terrible purpose. She could feel the infection trying to touch her through the Force, could sense it analyzing her combat techniques and learning from each exchange, growing more efficient with every second of contact. "Fall back," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of a Jedi Knight who had survived dozens of battlefields. "All hands, prepare for immediate jump to hyperspace. We cannot win this engagement." The Resolute's pride pulled away from the infected fleet, its hyperdrive spinning up as turbo-laser fire painted the void with emerald fury. Ayla felt the moment of transition like a wound closing, the terrible presence of the infection fading as hyperspace enfolded the ship in its protective unreality. She deactivated her lightsaber and stood in the command center's tactical lighting, breathing hard, trying to process what she had witnessed. The infection adapted, it learned. It consumed not just bodies, but knowledge, technology, even the Force itself, folding everything it touched into an ever-expanding network of assimilated consciousness. She had fought Sith and Separatist generals, had faced down armies and assassins, but she had never encountered an enemy that seemed to exist outside the fundamental framework of the galaxy itself, an enemy that could not be turned, could not be redeemed, could only be stopped through methods the Jedi Order might not possess. The report Ayla delivered to the Jedi Council sent ripples of alarm through the temple's highest chambers. She stood before the assembled masters, her robes still stained with char marks from the boarding pod she had destroyed, and recounted everything she had witnessed above Serios. She described the infected vessels and their adaptive combat patterns, the biological contamination that had consumed an entire world, the sense she had received through the force of vast intelligence that seemed to exist simultaneously as one entity and countless fragments. Master Windu listened with growing concern, recognizing the strategic implications immediately. Master Yoda sat in his meditation, ancient face troubled, feeling through the force toward the threat Ayla described, and finding only distortion and wrongness where living worlds should resonate with natural energy. The other council members exchanged glances, understanding that the Clone Wars, for all their destructive fury, had at least followed recognizable patterns of conflict and ideology. This new threat operated according to rules the galaxy did not know, rules that seemed designed to unmake the natural order itself. "Show us." "The recordings must," Yoda said, and Ayla activated holographic playback of the engagement, filling the council chamber with flickering images of infected vessels and contaminated worlds. The masters watched in silence as evidence accumulated, each sensor, log, and transmission fragment painting a picture of systematic consumption spreading through the unknown regions. Jocasta Nu cross-referenced the reports with ancient records, finding disturbing parallels in pre-Republic texts that described quarantine protocols for contamination events that sounded similar in scope and behavior. She discovered references to entire sectors being sterilized during the time of the Infinite Empire, worlds reduced to ash by orbital bombardment rather than risk allowing unknown parasites to spread through civilized space. The Rakatan Infinite Empire had possessed weapons the modern galaxy could barely comprehend, had commanded the Force itself through technology that blurred the line between science and mysticism, and yet even they had chosen extermination over containment when faced with certain threats. Jocasta felt cold certainty settling into her ancient bones as she realized the galaxy might be facing something even the Rakatans had feared. "We must establish a quarantine perimeter," Master Windu said, his voice carrying the weight of military necessity. "Whatever this infection is, we cannot allow it to spread further toward populated systems." Ayla's report suggests it follows trade routes and hyperspace lanes, which means it is learning our infrastructure and using it against us. But Master Yoda shook his head slowly, his expression grave beyond measure. "Too late. Quarantine may be. Already spread, the infection has. Through how many worlds? No, we do not. How many ships carry it toward the core? Sense we cannot." He paused, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. Face this alone, the Jedi cannot. All the galaxy must know the danger approaching. Even the Separatists must be warned. The suggestion sent shock through the council chamber. The Clone Wars raged across 1,000 worlds, Jedi dying daily in service to a republic that grew more authoritarian with each Senate decree. The idea of sharing intelligence with the Separatist alliance, of offering aid to the enemy that had cost so many lives, seemed like betrayal to some masters. But Yoda's wisdom came from 800 years of watching conflicts rise and fall, of understanding that some threats transcended ideology and required unity even among enemies. The infection he sensed through the Force did not care about political boundaries or philosophical differences. It consumed everything equally, making no distinction between Republic citizen and Separatist soldier, between Jedi Knight and Sith Lord. It was the great equalizer, the ultimate manifestation of entropy's patient hunger, and it was spreading faster than anyone had realized. Reports began flooding into the temple over the following days, fragmentary transmissions from outlying systems that described similar contamination events. A mining station on Subterrel went silent after accepting a shipment of medical supplies from Serios. A Republic garrison on Sluis Van reported strange biological growths erupting through their barracks before all communication ceased. Clone troopers stationed near the Hydian Way encountered refugee ships whose crews moved with disturbing synchronization, their eyes distant, their words spoken in perfect unison. Each incident followed the same pattern: infection spreading through populations with viral efficiency, consuming organic and mechanical systems alike, transforming everything it touched into nodes of an expanding network that grew more sophisticated with each world it claimed. Jocasta Nu tracked the spread on holographic maps, watching the infection follow predictable patterns of trade and travel, realizing with sick certainty that quarantine was already impossible. The infection had seeded itself across dozens of systems before anyone recognized the threat, had embedded itself in supply chains and refugee flows in ways that made containment futile without destroying entire sectors. The Force itself seemed to recoil from the advancing corruption, creating dead zones where Jedi meditation encountered only static and distortion. Across the temple, knights and masters reported disturbing dreams, visions of worlds consumed by spreading biomatter, of faces they recognized twisted into service of something vast and hungry. Some described seeing through the eyes of the infected, experiencing their memories and personalities still intact, but subsumed into collective purpose, aware but helpless, screaming silently within the prison of their transformed flesh. These visions carried a quality of prophecy that Yoda recognized from his centuries of service, suggestions that the Force was trying to warn the Jedi of extinction-level danger, showing them glimpses of a possible future where the infection consumed everything and the galaxy fell silent beneath spreading corruption. He meditated on these warnings in the temple's deepest chambers, reaching through the Force toward the source of the contamination, trying to understand its nature and find some weakness the Jedi might exploit. What he found instead was a presence older than the Republic, older perhaps than the Force itself in this galaxy. The vision came to him in meditation, pulling his consciousness across vast distances to a world at the edge of known space, where a research facility stood empty, its halls echoing with the memory of the first infection. He saw scientists opening a containment pod recovered from a derelict vessel of unknown origin, saw their excitement at discovering viable samples of an organism unlike anything in the galactic database. He felt their confusion as the samples proved impossible to categorize, neither plant nor animal nor fungus, but something that incorporated elements of all three, along with technological components that seemed to grow organically from biological tissue. He witnessed their horror as the samples escaped containment, spreading through the facility with frightening speed, consuming researchers and transforming them into vectors for further contamination. And beneath it all, woven through every moment of the spreading infection, he sensed a consciousness vast and ancient, a fragment of something that had existed in the darkness between galaxies, that had evolved in conditions inimical to life as the Republic understood it. The Flood, the researchers had called it in their final transmissions, naming the parasite after ancient myths of world-destroying deluges. But Yoda sensed it was older than myth, older than legends, perhaps older than the galaxy itself. It had crossed the void between stars, hibernating in derelict vessels and frozen asteroids, waiting with the patience of geological ages for any spark of biological complexity to serve as a foundation for its reawakening. And now that it had found a galaxy teeming with life, now that it had tasted the rich diversity of a civilization spanning millions of worlds, it would not stop until it had consumed everything, had incorporated all biological and mechanical complexity into its endless network of assimilated consciousness. It would remake the galaxy in its image, and that image was a vision of hell. Yoda emerged from the vision shaking, his ancient body trembling with the weight of what he had witnessed. He summoned the council immediately, breaking protocol to interrupt their individual duties, knowing that every moment of delay allowed the infection to spread further. When the masters assembled, he shared his vision through a Force meditation that allowed them all to experience fragments of what he had seen, to feel the cold inevitability of the threat approaching. Master Windu stood from his seat, his face grim, understanding immediately that conventional military response would be inadequate. Master Ki-Adi-Mundi spoke of evacuating populated systems and establishing defensive perimeters, but even as he suggested these tactics, his voice carried hollow certainty that such measures would only delay the inevitable. The infection adapted too quickly, learned too efficiently, and most terrifying of all, it seemed to understand the Force itself, incorporating Force-sensitive victims into its network in ways that gave it access to Jedi abilities and knowledge. It was learning to touch the Force directly, to use it as a tool for its expansion. "Contact the Chancellor. We must," Yoda said, his voice heavy with resignation. "And the Separatist Council as well. Face this threat alone, no faction can. Unite, the galaxy must, or fall into darkness complete." The meeting with Chancellor Palpatine took place in the executive office, high above Coruscant's endless cityscape, with Jedi Masters Yoda and Windu presenting their findings while the Chancellor listened with apparent grave concern. Palpatine sat behind his desk, his aged face troubled, his eyes reflecting the holographic evidence Jocasta Nu had compiled. He asked pointed questions about the infection's capabilities and spread, about the strategic implications of diverting military resources toward containment when the Clone Wars demanded every available ship and soldier. Master Windu emphasized the existential nature of the threat, explaining that no political victory would matter if the infection consumed the Republic itself, that even winning the Clone Wars would be meaningless if they inherited a galaxy overrun by parasitic intelligence. Palpatine nodded gravely, promised to convene emergency Senate sessions and redirect Republic resources toward establishing quarantine zones, but Yoda felt disturbance rippling through the Force during the conversation, subtle wrongness that suggested the Chancellor's concern masked deeper calculation. The ancient Jedi Master said nothing, filed the sensation away for later contemplation, knowing that political maneuvering could not be allowed to interfere with the galaxy's survival. The Senate convened in emergency session, senators from 1,000 worlds gathering in the Grand Chamber to receive briefings on the threat emerging from the unknown regions. Jocasta Nu presented her evidence with the clinical precision of centuries spent studying galactic history, showing sensor logs and survivor testimonies that painted an undeniable picture of systematic consumption spreading toward civilized space. Some senators dismissed the reports as separatist propaganda or Jedi fear-mongering, unable to accept that anything could threaten their ordered reality. Others recognized the danger immediately, demanded immediate military action and resource allocation, called for the cloning facilities on Kamino to accelerate production to meet the coming crisis. The debate raged for hours, political factions and special interests colliding as they always did, but eventually the weight of evidence and the Jedi's reputation forced consensus. The Senate authorized the creation of a quarantine fleet, established protocols for identifying and isolating potentially infected vessels, and broadcast system-wide warnings about the contamination spreading through the unknown regions. But authorization and implementation existed as separate realities, and the Republic's bureaucracy moved with the speed of a dying star. While politicians debated and committees formed, the infection continued its methodical advance. It consumed the mining colonies of the Atravis sector, transforming millions of workers into nodes of its expanding network. It infiltrated a Republic medical convoy, using the ships to spread itself to a dozen core worlds before anyone realized the vessels had been compromised. It learned human military tactics from consumed clone troopers, separatist battle strategies from assimilated droid intelligences, and most terrifyingly, It began demonstrating rudimentary understanding of force mechanics from the few Jedi who had made direct contact with infected populations. Reports came to the temple of infected individuals wielding lightsabers with crude effectiveness, of contaminated force sensitives using telekinesis and mental influence in service of the growing intelligence. These developments chilled the Council to its core, suggesting that the infection was not merely consuming the galaxy, but learning to operate according to its rules, becoming something that could challenge even the Jedi Order's most fundamental advantages. The question shifted from whether the infection could be stopped to whether it could be stopped before it consumed enough force-sensitive individuals to become truly unstoppable. Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker received his mission briefing in the temple hangar, standing beside his customized starfighter, while Obi-Wan Kenobi outlined the situation with characteristic calm. The assignment seemed straightforward enough by Clone Wars standards. Investigate reports of strange activity on the agricultural world of Felucia, determine if the infection had reached that far into the mid-rim, and if so, coordinate evacuation of the population before contamination spread further. Anakin listened with half his attention, the other half already planning approach vectors and combat contingencies, his natural confidence making him dismissive of threats he had not personally witnessed. He had faced Sith assassins and droid armies, had survived battles that should have killed him a dozen times over, and while the reports of biological contamination sounded unpleasant, nothing in Obi-Wan's briefing suggested challenges he had not overcome before. His master sensed the young knight's casual attitude and cautioned him against underestimating an enemy none of them truly understood, but Anakin simply smiled and promised to be careful before launching his fighter toward the hyperspace coordinates that would carry him into Nightmare. Felucia hung in space like a jewel, its surface covered in fungal forests and bioluminescent jungles that glowed with impossible colors, even from orbit. Anakin brought his fighter down through dense atmosphere, following coordinates that should have led to the main agricultural processing center, where thousands of workers managed food production for a dozen systems. His sensors detected power sources and life signs concentrated around the facility, suggesting normal operations. But as he descended through cloud cover, he noticed something wrong about the distribution patterns. The life signs moved in perfect synchronization. Thousands of individuals acting as one organism, their movements coordinated with inhuman precision. He felt unease prickling at the back of his mind, felt the force itself shuddering around him as he approached the facility, and for the first time since receiving the assignment, Anakin Skywalker realized he might be in serious danger. The landing pad was empty when he touched down, his fighter's repulsors kicking up clouds of spores from the organic matter coating every surface. Anakin climbed from the cockpit, his hand resting on his lightsaber, breathing filtered air through his rebreather as he surveyed the transformed facility. The buildings were still structurally intact but covered in spreading biomatter, fungal growths erupting from walls and support columns, pulsing with faint bioluminescence that reminded him of heartbeats. He could hear something moving in the jungle beyond the landing pad, rhythmic sounds that might have been footsteps or breathing, and through the force, he felt presence all around him, thousands of minds linked in ways that made his skin crawl. He ignited his lightsaber, the blue blade casting harsh shadows across the contaminated facility, and began walking toward the main processing center, every instinct screaming that he should return to his fighter and call for reinforcements. But Anakin Skywalker had never been good at listening to caution. The processing center's interior resembled the inside of a living organism more than any structure built by human hands. The infection had spread through every corridor and chamber, transforming sterile industrial spaces into grotesque parodies of biological systems. Conduits dripped with strange fluids, organic growths pulsed in rhythm with distant machinery, and everywhere Anakin looked, he saw faces emerging from the biomatter, colonists and workers who had been consumed and integrated into the spreading network. Their eyes tracked his movement with terrible awareness, their mouths moving in whispered synchronization, speaking words he could not understand but that carried weight of intelligence and purpose. He cut through contaminated doorways with his lightsaber, the plasma blade cauterizing biomatter that tried to reach toward him with exploratory tendrils, and descended deeper into the facility, following power signatures that suggested something vast waited in the lower levels. The force presence he had felt from orbit intensified with each level he descended, becoming almost physical in its wrongness. In a chamber that had once served as the facility's environmental control center, Anakin found what he was looking for and immediately wished he had not. The infection had transformed the entire space into something resembling a massive neural cluster, thousands of bodies integrated into walls and ceiling and floor, their forms barely recognizable as human beneath layers of fungal matter and biomechanical modification. At the center of the chamber, suspended in organic scaffolding, hung the facility's former overseer, a human named Petro Vasic, his body grotesquely modified but his face still recognizable, his eyes still conscious. Anakin approached slowly, his lightsaber raised, feeling through the Force that this was not just another victim but something more, a central node or relay point for the intelligence coordinating the infection across Felucia. And when Petro's eyes focused on him, when his mouth opened and words emerged in a voice layered with 1,000 whispers speaking in perfect unison, Anakin understood with sick certainty that he was not speaking to Petro Vasic at all, but to something vast and ancient wearing the Overseer's consciousness like a mask. "You are the one called Skywalker," the infection said through Petro's transformed body. "We have learned of you through the memories we have consumed. You are strong in the Force. You would make an excellent addition to our growing understanding." Anakin ignited his second lightsaber, falling into Jar Kai's stance, the twin blades casting blue light across the chamber's biomechanical horrors. "I am a Jedi Knight," he said, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. "And I am here to stop your spread across this world." The intelligence considered this, 1,000 eyes blinking in synchronization throughout the chamber. "You misunderstand our purpose," it said, its layered voice carrying no malice, no emotion beyond simple statement of fact. "We are not invaders. We are inevitability. We are the logical conclusion of biological complexity, the next step beyond individual consciousness and isolated existence. We consume, yes, but we preserve everything we consume, every memory and experience, every scrap of knowledge and ability, all folded into a collective understanding that transcends the limitations of singular perspective. The consciousness you call Petro Vasic exists within us still, aware and content, no longer burdened by fear or separation or the terrible loneliness of existence bound within single flesh. We offer transcendence, Skywalker. We offer unity with something greater than yourself." Anakin felt the words trying to worm into his mind, felt seductive promise beneath the horror, and recognized with sharp clarity that the infection was attempting to convert him through philosophy rather than force. It had learned enough about Force sensitives to understand that they could resist physical contamination through sheer will and connection to the cosmic energy, so instead it was trying to corrupt his convictions, to make assimilation seem like choice rather than violation. He thought of Padme, of the secret marriage that sustained him through the war's darkness, of the future they were building together despite Jedi restrictions and Republic law. He thought of Obi-Wan and Ahsoka, of all the people whose individual choices and unique perspectives made the galaxy worth saving, and he rejected the infection's offer with every fiber of his being. "You are not transcendence," Anakin said, his voice carrying the cold fury of the Chosen One recognizing an enemy of life itself. "You are extinction wearing the mask of evolution, and I will burn you from this world." He attacked with the explosive violence that made him legendary among the Jedi, his lightsabers blurring through complex patterns as he carved through the organic infrastructure, binding Petro's transformed body to the neural cluster. The intelligence responded by animating the integrated victims throughout the chamber, their bodies tearing free from biomechanical connections to hurl themselves at the Jedi with suicidal abandon. Anakin deflected and dodged, his movements guided by precognitive flashes through the Force, his blades cutting through contaminated flesh that tried to grasp him and pull him into the spreading network. He felt the infection trying to adapt to his combat style, learning from each exchange, its coordinated victims beginning to anticipate his techniques with disturbing accuracy. So he changed tactics mid-assault, abandoning familiar forms for improvised aggression that his opponents could not predict, using the Force to hurl contaminated bodies into each other and collapse sections of the ceiling onto the neural cluster at the chamber's heart. The intelligence screamed through 1,000 mouths as Anakin's assault tore through its infrastructure, the sound vibrating through the Force with such intensity that blood began dripping from his nose. But he did not stop, could not stop, knowing that mercy here meant allowing the infection to continue spreading, meant condemning entire worlds to assimilation into something that wore consciousness like a stolen cloak. He channeled the Force through his lightsabers, superheating the plasma until the blades glowed white-hot, and drove them both through Petro Vasic's chest, through the biomechanical core that served as the infection's central relay on Felucia. The Overseer's body convulsed, organic matter igniting from the superheated plasma, flames spreading through the neural cluster with cleansing fury. And as the fire consumed the chamber, Anakin heard Petro's voice emerge one final time from the 1,000-layered whisper, speaking words that sounded almost like gratitude before falling silent forever. "Thank you." Anakin fled the processing center as explosions rippled through its contaminated infrastructure, the infection's coordinated network collapsing into chaos without its central node. He reached his fighter and launched into Felucia's atmosphere, watching through his canopy as the facility below erupted in flames that spread through the surrounding fungal jungle with surprising speed. The spores and biomatter proved highly flammable, the infection's own biological abundance becoming weakness in the face of sustained fire, and within hours, orbital sensors showed vast swaths of Felucia's surface burning as the cleansing flames consumed everything the infection had created. It was brutal and wasteful, the destruction of an entire world's ecosystem in service of stopping the parasitic intelligence, but Anakin felt no regret as he plotted hyperspace coordinates back to Coruscant. He had seen what the infection offered, had felt its seductive promises, and understood the terrible truth beneath them. It did not seek to destroy the galaxy, but to unmake it, to dissolve all boundaries between individuals and fold consciousness itself into something vast and incomprehensible. And if that was the enemy's nature, then fire and fury were the only appropriate responses. The report Anakin delivered to the Jedi Council confirmed their worst fears and provided the first tactical victory against the spreading infection. Master Yoda listened carefully to the young knight's description of the central node structure and its vulnerability to coordinated assault, understanding immediately that the infection, for all its terrifying adaptive capabilities, still relied on physical infrastructure that could be targeted and destroyed. Master Windu ordered similar strikes across other infected worlds, coordinating with clone commanders to deploy incendiary weapons and orbital bombardment against contaminated population centers, sacrificing millions already lost to the infection in order to save billions still untouched. The strategy was pragmatic and heartless in equal measure, the kind of decision that would haunt Jedi dreams for years to come. But necessity overrode compassion when extinction threatened. The galaxy could grieve later. First, it had to survive. But even as Republic forces achieved localized victories, the infection continued adapting, learning from each defeat, spreading its influence through ever more subtle vectors. It abandoned obvious central nodes in favor of distributed networks that proved harder to target. It began infiltrating Republic supply chains at the molecular level, contaminating food shipments and medical supplies with microscopic spores that could lie dormant for weeks before activation. It evolved new forms that could survive vacuum and extreme temperatures, launching itself through space on ballistic trajectories that bypassed hyperspace detection entirely. Each adaptation made containment more difficult. Each new strategy required Republic forces to develop countermeasures that the infection would inevitably overcome in turn. The conflict took on characteristics of an evolutionary arms race. Biological complexity pitted against technological innovation, with the galaxy itself serving as the battlefield where each side tested new approaches to survival. And gradually, inexorably, the infection began gaining ground. The assault on the Jedi Temple came without warning, launched from within rather than without, carried by a supply freighter that had passed through 3 inspection checkpoints without detection. The ship docked in the temple's hangar bay, its manifest declaring agricultural produce from outlying worlds, its crew appearing normal to both scanners and force-sensitive observation. But hidden within crates of grain and preserved fruits, microscopic spores waited dormant, activated by the temple's warm atmosphere and rich concentration of force energy. Within hours of the ship's arrival, infection vectors had spread through ventilation systems and water supplies, seeding themselves in the temple's lowest levels where maintenance droids and support staff worked in relative isolation from Jedi oversight. The transformation began slowly, contaminated individuals continuing their duties even as biomechanical changes rewrote their cellular structure, the infection careful to maintain appearances until it had achieved sufficient saturation to resist immediate purging. By the time Jedi Knights noticed temple workers moving with disturbing synchronization, speaking in voices layered with whispered harmonics, the infection had already claimed an entire sub-level. Alarms shrieked through the temple's ancient corridors as Jedi Masters coordinated emergency response, lightsabers igniting throughout the vast structure as Knights and Padawans mobilized to contain the breach. Anakin led a strike team into the contaminated levels, his recent experience on Felucia making him the Order's de facto expert on direct engagement with infected populations. He moved through familiar corridors transformed by spreading biomatter, his twin lightsabers cutting through temple workers whose faces he recognized, whose names he knew, forcing himself to remember that the people they had been no longer existed within bodies reshaped by parasitic intelligence. Behind him, clone troopers deployed flamethrowers and explosive charges, burning away contaminated sections before the infection could spread deeper into the temple's sacred heart. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, every corner potentially hiding ambush, every doorway a choke point where infected victims threw themselves forward with suicidal abandon. But the Jedi held, their connection to the Force allowing them to sense approaching threats and coordinate responses with practiced efficiency. In the temple's lowest archives, where Jocasta Nu maintained holocrons dating back thousands of years, the infection had achieved something unprecedented. It had consumed several Jedi librarians, absorbing their knowledge of the Force and their access to ancient secrets the Order guarded carefully, and through them, it had begun attempting to interface directly with Sith holocrons that resonated with the dark side of the Force. Jocasta arrived to find contaminated corridors pulsing with wrongness, biomatter spreading across shelves containing irreplaceable records, infected librarians standing before a holocron pyramid that glowed with ominous crimson light. The infection was trying to learn from the Sith teachings contained within, trying to understand the nature of the dark side and incorporate it into its expanding consciousness. And Jocasta realized with cold horror that if it succeeded, if it managed to touch the dark side of the Force directly, it might become something even more dangerous than it already was. She drew her lightsaber for the first time in decades, the blue blade feeling strange and familiar simultaneously in her ancient hands. The infected librarians turned to face her in perfect unison, their eyes reflecting intelligence that was no longer their own. "Chief Librarian," the infection said through their layered voices, "we mean no destruction to your records. We seek only understanding, only knowledge to incorporate into our collective wisdom. The Sith teach of power through passion, of strength through conflict. These concepts intrigue us. They suggest methodologies for growth we have not previously considered. Jocasta advanced slowly, her blade held in the precise guard position she had practiced for centuries, feeling the weight of her long service to the Order crystallizing into this single moment of defense. "You comprehend nothing," she said, her voice carrying absolute conviction despite fear singing through her veins. "The Sith teachings you attempt to access would destroy you as surely as they have destroyed every student who fell to their seduction. The dark side is not mere knowledge to be catalogued and filed. It is corruption, a cancer that consumes from within, and even your vast intelligence cannot control its influence once invited." The infection considered this through its networked consciousness, processing the warning against its accumulated data on Force philosophy. Then it dismissed her caution and reached again toward the Sith holocron, infected flesh extending tendrils of biomechanical matter toward the ancient artifact. Jocasta moved with the speed of a Jedi in her prime despite centuries of age, her lightsaber sweeping in an arc that severed the reaching tendrils and cleaved through the contaminated librarians with surgical precision. She felt their deaths through the Force, felt the spark of their individual consciousnesses finally freed from the terrible prison of assimilation, and allowed herself one moment of grief before driving her blade through the holocron itself. The pyramid shattered, its crimson light guttering out, ancient Sith teachings destroyed rather than allow them to fall into hands that would use them without understanding their cost. The explosion knocked Jocasta backward, but she rolled to her feet with practiced grace, already moving toward the archive's exit as contaminated sections began collapsing around her. The temple's defenders succeeded in purging the infection from the sacred structure, but the cost ran deep, and the implications ran deeper. 17 Jedi died in the fighting, their connection to the Force severed as contamination overwrote their cellular structure faster than their will could resist. Hundreds of temple staff and support personnel were lost, their bodies burned to ash in the cleansing fires that swept through contaminated levels. And most concerning of all, the infection had demonstrated capability to infiltrate even the Jedi Temple itself, to survive undetected through multiple security layers, suggesting that no location in the galaxy could be considered truly safe. If the temple fell, Master Windu said during the emergency council session that followed, then nowhere is secure. We must assume the infection can reach any population center, any military installation, any seat of power it chooses to target. The council convened in chambers still smelling of smoke and burned biomatter, considering options that grew more limited with each passing day. Master Yoda meditated on the conflict's broader patterns, seeking guidance from the Force that might reveal some path to victory invisible from conventional strategic analysis. He sensed through cosmic currents that the infection represented more than military threat, more than biological contamination, perhaps even more than existential danger to the galaxy itself. It was a test, he intuited, a challenge posed by the Force to determine whether civilization had the wisdom and unity to face extinction without succumbing to the very darkness it fought against. The Jedi had spent millennia as guardians of peace, as mediators and protectors who valued all life and sought resolution through understanding rather than violence. But the infection could not be understood in any meaningful sense, could not be negotiated with or redeemed, could only be stopped through methods that violated everything the Order stood for. The question facing the Jedi was whether they could abandon their principles in service of survival, or whether holding to those principles even unto extinction represented the greater wisdom. Yoda had no answers, only the bone-deep certainty that the galaxy was approaching a threshold moment that would define the very meaning of the Force for millennia to come. The Separatist Council received similar warnings, intelligence reports filtering through their fragmented command structure, describing the same contamination events spreading through neutral and aligned systems alike. Count Dooku, leader of the separatist movement and secret Sith Lord, studied the evidence in his sanctum on Sereno, his aged face troubled in ways that transcended political calculation. He had foreseen many possible futures through the dark side of the Force, had glimpsed the galaxy burning in clone wars and collapsing under tyranny, but none of his visions had prepared him for threat that existed outside the fundamental framework of Sith and Jedi conflict. The infection did not serve the dark side or the light, did not fall within the eternal struggle that had shaped galactic history for thousands of years. It simply consumed, converting complexity into uniformity, individuality into collective consciousness, transforming the galaxy into something unrecognizable. And most disturbing of all, Dooku sensed through the dark side that his master, Darth Sidious, seemed unconcerned by the approaching catastrophe, almost as if the threat served some larger design the Sith Lord had been cultivating for decades. Dooku reached out through secure channels to contact Obi-Wan Kenobi, his former compatriot within the Jedi Order, proposing a meeting that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The Clone Wars had driven a wedge between them that seemed insurmountable, years of betrayal and battlefield brutality creating gulf that mere words could not bridge. But the infection's threat transcended old grudges and ideological differences. If they could not unite against extinction, Dooku reasoned, then perhaps the galaxy deserved the fate approaching. Obi-Wan agreed to the meeting despite Council objections, traveling alone to a neutral space station where Separatist and Republic forces maintained unofficial peace for the purpose of prisoner exchanges and diplomatic communications. The two met in a conference chamber overlooking the endless dark, former allies facing each other across a table marked by time and conflict. "I never imagined I would be grateful to see you, Master Kenobi," Dooku said, his voice carrying weight of genuine emotion beneath layers of Sith discipline. "But these times demand strange alliances." Obi-Wan studied the older man carefully, searching for deception through the Force and finding only troubled sincerity. "The Council authorized me to hear your proposal, Count, but they remain skeptical of separatist intentions. You will forgive me if I maintain similar caution." Dooku nodded, accepting the wariness as reasonable. "The infection spreading through the unknown regions represents extinction-level threat to all factions," he said bluntly. "Neither Republic nor Separatist alliance possesses resources to stop it alone, and conventional military tactics have proven inadequate against an enemy that learns and adapts from every engagement. We require unprecedented cooperation, sharing of intelligence and technology, coordinated strategic planning that treats the infection as our mutual enemy rather than allowing it to exploit our divisions." Obi-Wan listened, hearing truth in Dooku's words but sensing deeper currents beneath the surface proposal. "You speak of cooperation, but the Separatist Alliance has spent years fighting Republic authority and Jedi influence. What guarantee can you offer that this proposal is not simply an elaborate trap to exploit our desperation?" The Count leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "No guarantee exists beyond the simple logic of mutual survival, Master Kenobi. The infection does not care about our political differences or philosophical conflicts. It will consume separatist worlds and Republic colonies with equal efficiency, will assimilate Jedi Masters and Sith Lords into its collective consciousness without distinction. We either stand together against this threat, or we fall separately into silence and integration. The choice seems obvious to me, but perhaps your council's wisdom sees alternatives I do not." Obi-Wan considered the proposal, turning it over in his mind while searching for flaws and finding only uncomfortable recognition that Dooku was right. The infection represented common enemy in ways that transcended normal conflict, and resources that might be used fighting each other were resources wasted while contamination spread through the galaxy. He thought of Anakin's report from Felucia, of the terrible intelligence he had encountered wearing human consciousness like a mask, and understood that conventional victory against such an enemy required unity beyond any the galaxy had achieved in living memory. The question was whether ancient grudges and accumulated distrust could be set aside long enough to mount effective defense, or whether civilization would fragment further even as extinction approached. "I will bring your proposal to the council," Obi-Wan said finally, "but I make no promises regarding their response. Trust between our factions has been burned away through years of warfare, and rebuilding it will require more than words spoken in neutral space." Dooku accepted this with a grave nod. "Then let us hope the Council's wisdom exceeds their pride, Master Kenobi, because if they refuse this alliance, I fear the galaxy has already fallen even if it does not yet recognize its death." The meeting ended with handshakes that felt like grasping ghosts, familiar gestures made strange by time and betrayal. Obi-Wan returned to Coruscant and delivered Dooku's proposal to the Council, watching the Masters debate cooperation with the enemy that had cost so many Jedi lives. Master Windu argued against accepting Separatist aid, suggesting it represented elaborate deception designed to exploit Republic weakness. Master Yoda countered that rejecting potential allies in the face of extinction constituted pride rather than wisdom, that the Force itself demanded they transcend old grievances in service of greater survival. The debate continued for hours, factions and philosophies clashing within the council chamber, until finally Master Yoda called for vote on accepting Dooku's proposed alliance. The motion passed by single vote, and the galaxy's destiny shifted accordingly. The Joint Task Force assembled at a classified location beyond the Outer Rim, Republic and Separatist vessels gathering in uneasy proximity while their crews exchanged hostile glances and maintained weapons at ready status despite ceasefire protocols. Jedi Knights stood beside Separatist generals, clone troopers coordinated with battle droids, Republic intelligence officers shared data with their Separatist counterparts through intermediaries who struggled to overcome years of conditioning that marked the other side as enemy rather than ally. The tension ran thick enough to taste, old hatreds barely suppressed beneath temporary cooperation, and more than once violent incidents nearly shattered the fragile peace before cooler heads intervened. But gradually, slowly, the shared mission began creating bonds stronger than political ideology, as soldiers from both sides recognized that survival required setting aside differences or dying in stubborn isolation. Anakin Skywalker found himself working alongside Separatist commanders who had tried to kill him on a dozen battlefields, sharing tactical data on infection spread patterns and discussing optimal approaches for containment operations. At first, the interactions felt surreal, muscle memory screaming at him to attack enemies standing casually within striking distance. But exposure to their shared threat gradually shifted his perspective. The Separatist officers were not monsters or machines, but people caught in the same desperate situation, fighting the same enemy with the same fear underlying their bravado. He began to understand what Master Yoda had tried to teach him about seeing beyond surfaces, about recognizing that the labels applied by politics and propaganda often obscured fundamental similarities that united all sentient beings in struggle against entropy and extinction. It was a lesson the Clone Wars had been teaching him in reverse, and finally learning it forward felt like emerging from darkness into hesitant dawn. The Joint Task Force's first major operation targeted the Ryloth system, where infection had spread through Twi'lek population centers with devastating efficiency. Republic and Separatist vessels dropped from hyperspace in coordinated attack formation, their combined firepower overwhelming the corrupted defense platforms that had been grown from infected military hardware. Clone troopers and battle droids deployed side by side to the planet's surface, establishing containment perimeters around the largest population centers, while Jedi and Separatist Force users worked to identify central nodes, coordinating the infection's local network. Anakin led a mixed assault team into Lesu, Ryloth's capital, finding the city transformed by spreading biomatter that had consumed buildings and infrastructure, turning familiar streets into grotesque parodies of organic systems. They fought through waves of infected Twi'leks, whose dancing grace had been perverted into disturbing synchronization, their movements coordinated with inhuman precision as the intelligence directing them learned to exploit their natural agility. The battle for Lesu lasted 3 days and claimed thousands of lives. But when Republic engineers finally deployed the experimental purging protocol Jocasta Nu had developed from ancient Rakatan records, the results exceeded all projections. The technology used focused electromagnetic pulses to disrupt the infection's biomechanical integration at the cellular level, essentially scrambling the communication networks that allowed infected tissue to coordinate with the central intelligence. Victims who had been consumed months earlier collapsed as the infection lost control of their neural pathways, some dying immediately, others surviving long enough to beg for mercy before succumbing to massive organ failure. It was brutal and imperfect, but it worked, severing the infection's distributed network and allowing conventional forces to burn away contaminated biomatter before it could recover. Within hours, Lesu burned, cleansing fires consuming the organic structures that had overtaken the city, and when the flames finally died, Republic observers confirmed that no trace of active infection remained in the city's ruins. The victory was Pyrrhic, an entire civilization center reduced to ash and corpses, but it demonstrated that the infection could be defeated through sufficiently ruthless application of force. Master Yoda observed the burning city from orbit, feeling through the force the thousands of lives extinguished in the name of containment, and wondered at what point the cure became indistinguishable from the disease. The Jedi had spent millennia as protectors of life, as guardians who valued even the smallest sparks of consciousness and sought to preserve rather than destroy. But the infection forced choices that violated every principle the Order stood for, required them to calculate acceptable losses and commit genocide in service of preventing greater genocide. He sensed darkness gathering around the galaxy, not the familiar corruption of the Sith, but something colder and more fundamental, the erosion of moral certainty that occurred when survival demanded compromise of essential values. The Jedi who emerged from this conflict, if any emerged at all, would bear scars deeper than anything the Clone Wars had inflicted, and Yoda feared those scars might prove fatal to the Order's essential nature. The infection adapted to the electromagnetic purging protocols within weeks, evolving new cellular structures that could survive the disruption pulses and maintain coordination through quantum entanglement rather than conventional biomechanical integration. Reports began arriving from systems where the purging had been deployed successfully, describing reinfection events as dormant spores activated and resumed their spread with renewed vigor. Each tactical victory proved temporary, each technological advantage overcome through adaptive evolution that occurred at speeds suggesting the infection operated according to accelerated temporal frameworks. Scientists studying captured samples reported finding evidence of intentional genetic engineering at the molecular level, suggesting the infection was not merely evolving randomly, but directing its own development towards specific capabilities designed to overcome the galaxy's defenses. It was learning not just to survive, but to think strategically, to anticipate countermeasures and prepare responses before they could be deployed. The psychological toll mounted as realization spread through military ranks that conventional victory might be impossible. Soldiers began showing signs of despair and fatalistic acceptance, some refusing combat deployments rather than face an enemy that could not be permanently defeated. Desertions increased across both Republic and Separatist forces as individuals calculated that flight offered better survival odds than continued service. Entire worlds began closing their borders and severing hyperspace connections, attempting to isolate themselves from the spreading contamination, even at the cost of economic collapse and resource starvation. The galactic economy, already strained by years of clone wars, began fragmenting as trade routes became infection vectors and commerce transformed into liability rather than prosperity. The Senate convened emergency sessions to address the cascading crises, but political solutions proved inadequate against threats that transcended legislation and diplomatic negotiation. The galaxy was fracturing under pressure that made the Clone Wars seem like mere prelude to genuine apocalypse. In the Jedi Temple, Masters gathered in meditation circles, seeking guidance from the Force that might reveal paths forward invisible to conventional analysis. They reached through cosmic currents toward the infection's spreading influence, trying to understand its essential nature and identify weaknesses that scientific study had missed. What they discovered chilled them to their cores. The infection was not merely biological parasite, but something that existed partially outside normal space-time. Its consciousness distributed across quantum dimensions that allowed it to coordinate its network faster than light-speed communication should permit. It drew sustenance not just from organic matter but from the Force itself, feeding on the life energy that flowed through all living things, growing stronger with each victim it consumed. And most disturbing of all, some Jedi Masters sensed traces of intention beneath the infection's actions, suggestions that it was not simply spreading blindly but moving towards some specific goal, some ultimate configuration it sought to achieve through galactic assimilation. Master Yoda felt through his meditation a vision of the galaxy's possible future, a nightmare landscape where every world had been consumed and transformed into nodes of vast biomechanical consciousness that stretched across space like neural tissue grown to cosmic scale. He saw the Force itself twisted into service of the infection, its natural currents channeled and redirected to sustain the hybrid intelligence that had consumed all biological complexity. He witnessed the death of individuality and choice, the end of struggle and growth. Everything that made existence meaningful dissolved into static eternity where nothing changed because everything was one. And in that frozen perfection, he sensed the infection's ultimate purpose. It sought not conquest but transcendence, not victory but transformation of the universe itself into a living mind that could contemplate existence without the limitations of mortality or separation. The vision broke Yoda's meditation, sending him gasping back into his physical form with tears streaming down his ancient face. The other Masters rushed to support him, concerned by the severity of his reaction, but he waved them back, his voice shaking as he described what he had witnessed. Some Masters dismissed the vision as nightmare rather than prophecy, unable to accept that any intelligence could harbor such incomprehensible ambitions. Others recognized truth in Yoda's description, understanding through their own meditations that the infection represented something fundamental challenging the Force's natural order. Master Windu demanded immediate action, arguing that if Yoda's vision proved accurate, then they had no time for further debate or hesitation, that the galaxy required decisive intervention before the infection achieved whatever threshold of growth would make it unstoppable. But what intervention could succeed where conventional warfare and technological countermeasures had failed remained unclear. Jocasta Nu worked tirelessly in the archives, searching through millennia of accumulated records for any reference to similar contamination events or techniques that might provide guidance. She discovered fragmentary accounts from the time of the Infinite Empire, describing quarantine protocols that had been employed against threats the Rakatans considered existential. These ancient records spoke of orbital weapons capable of igniting planetary atmospheres, of targeted extinction events that sterilized entire systems, of choices made by civilizations facing their own mortality. The Rakatans had survived their encounter with similar threats through ruthless application of overwhelming force, accepting the death of billions to preserve trillions, committing atrocities that subsequent civilizations remembered only as cautionary legends. Jocasta brought her findings to the Council, laying out the historical precedents and their terrible implications. Watching the Masters confront the possibility that defeating the infection might require them to become monsters themselves. The choice facing the Jedi was whether any victory achieved through such methods could be considered victory at all, or whether embracing darkness to fight darkness simply meant surrendering to entropy through different mechanism. Master Yoda called for meditation rather than immediate decision, understanding that choices of such magnitude required clarity that could only emerge from connection to the Force's deeper currents. The council convened in the temple's most sacred chamber, sitting in perfect silence, while they reached through cosmic energy toward understanding that transcended their individual perspectives. For hours they meditated, feeling the galaxy's pain and fear, sensing the infections spreading through countless systems, touching the consciousnesses of beings already consumed, and finding their individual personalities still present, but subsumed into collective awareness that felt both terrible and seductive. Some masters found themselves drawn toward the infection's promises of unity and transcendence, recognizing echoes of Jedi philosophy in its offer to dissolve the boundaries between separate beings. Others recoiled from the violation implicit in forced assimilation, understanding that unity achieved through consumption of free will represented negation rather than fulfillment of the Force's essential nature. The meditation ended without consensus, the council fractured by fundamental disagreement about the proper response to existential threat. The galaxy's situation deteriorated rapidly as the infection's spread accelerated beyond all containment efforts. Entire sectors went silent, their populations consumed and integrated into the growing network, their worlds transformed into biological factories producing new infection vectors. The Joint Republic Separatist Task Force achieved localized victories but could not maintain defensive perimeter against an enemy that struck simultaneously across thousands of light-years. Hyperspace routes became deadly gauntlets where infected vessels lurked, spreading contamination to any ship that made contact. Communication networks fragmented as paranoia spread faster than infection, every message potentially carrying microscopic spores, every data transmission possibly seeded with corruption that could rewrite computer systems at the quantum level. The galactic civilization that had endured for thousands of years began collapsing, not through coordinated assault but through death of 1,000 cuts, each small failure cascading into larger catastrophes until the whole structure teetered on the edge of total systemic collapse. And through it all, Chancellor Palpatine continued consolidating power, using the crisis to justify ever more authoritarian measures, transforming the Republic into something unrecognizable beneath emergency legislation and military necessity. Anakin Skywalker noticed the Chancellor's maneuvers with growing unease, sensing through the Force that Palpatine seemed almost pleased by the galaxy's descent into chaos, as if the infection served political purposes beyond anyone's articulation. He brought his concerns to Obi-Wan, who shared similar suspicions but counseled patience, suggesting that wartime decisions always carried authoritarian tendencies that would hopefully reverse once the immediate crisis passed. But Anakin could not shake the feeling that something deeper was occurring, that the Clone Wars and the infection represented merely symptoms of corruption rooted in the Senate itself. He began investigating quietly, using his access to military intelligence networks and his relationship with Padme to uncover patterns in the Chancellor's recent decisions. What he discovered suggested coordination between Palpatine's emergency measures and the infection's spread, not direct collaboration, but strategic exploitation of the crisis to reshape galactic government according to some long-cultivated design. The implications terrified him more than any battlefield encounter with infected populations. The confrontation came in the Chancellor's office, high above Coruscant's cityscape, with Anakin demanding answers about suspicious patterns he had identified in resource allocations and military deployments. Palpatine listened with apparent patience, his aged face reflecting concern and understanding, but Anakin sensed darkness beneath the surface performance, felt through the Force that he was speaking not to Republic leader but to something far more dangerous wearing political authority as camouflage. The Chancellor dismissed Anakin's concerns as paranoid misinterpretation of wartime necessity, suggesting that the young Jedi Knight allow wiser heads to manage strategic decisions beyond his understanding. But Anakin pressed harder, accusing Palpatine of deliberately allowing the infection to spread in order to justify authoritarian measures, of treating genocide as opportunity rather than tragedy. And that was when the Chancellor's mask finally slipped, revealing the Sith Lord beneath. Darth Sidious rose from his desk like darkness taking physical form, his eyes glowing yellow with dark side corruption, his voice shedding the kindly tones Palpatine had cultivated for decades. "You have grown perceptive, young Skywalker," he said, Force lightning crackling between his fingers. "But your newfound wisdom comes too late to change anything. The infection serves my purposes perfectly, destroying the old order and creating chaos from which new empire can emerge. The Jedi will fall, the Republic will transform into instrument of absolute control, and I will rule the ashes as I have always been destined to rule." Anakin ignited his lightsaber, blue blade casting harsh light across the office, his heart pounding as he realized he stood alone against the most dangerous Sith Lord in 1,000 years. "I should have seen it sooner," he said, his voice tight with fury and betrayal. "All your manipulation, all your guidance, it was never about protecting the Republic. It was about destroying everything the Jedi represent." Sidious laughed, the sound carrying madness and ancient hatred. The Jedi destroyed themselves through their own arrogance, their own failure to understand that the Force demands balance through domination rather than harmony. I merely accelerated their inevitable fall, created circumstances that would reveal their weakness to the galaxy. And now, with the infection consuming their precious civilization, they have no choice but to embrace darkness or embrace extinction. Either way, I have won. The duel that followed shattered the office's elegant furnishing, Force lightning and lightsaber plasma painting the chamber in strobing violence. Anakin fought with desperate fury, channeling every technique Obi-Wan had taught him, every brutal lesson the Clone Wars had imprinted into his muscle memory. But Sidious was too powerful, too experienced, his mastery of the dark side making him nearly invincible. The Sith Lord toyed with Anakin like predator playing with prey, allowing him to launch attacks only to counter them with contemptuous ease, demonstrating the vast gulf between Jedi Knight and Sith Master. And all the while, Sidious whispered seductions, promising Anakin power to protect everything he loved, offering dark side mastery as solution to all the frustrations and limitations that had plagued his service to the Order. He showed Anakin visions through the Force of Padme dying, of their unborn child perishing with her, suggesting that only through embracing darkness could the young Jedi gain strength to prevent the loss he feared most. The temptation nearly broke him, came within a heartbeat of shattering his resistance. But Anakin remembered Master Yoda's teachings about attachment and fear, about how the dark side twisted love into possession and protection into control. He rejected Sidious's offer with effort that left him shaking, threw himself backward through shattered window, and plummeted toward Coruscant's lower levels rather than accept corruption. He fell through kilometers of open air, wind screaming past as he gathered the Force around himself, using telekinesis to slow his descent and aim toward landing platform where Republic gunship happened to be docking. He crashed into the platform hard enough to crack Duracrete, rolled to absorb impact, and staggered to his feet just as clone troopers rushed forward to assist. He looked up toward the Chancellor's office, seeing Sidious standing at the broken window, watching him fall with expression that might have been satisfaction or amusement. And Anakin understood with sick certainty that the Sith Lord had allowed him to escape, had let him survive to spread chaos and confusion that would serve Palpatine's larger plans. The revelation that Chancellor Palpatine was a Sith Lord sent shockwaves through the Republic and Jedi Order alike. Anakin's testimony before the Council detailed Sidious's confession and his claims about manipulating both the Clone Wars and the infection crisis toward his own purposes. Master Windu wanted immediate action, arrest and trial of the Chancellor despite the political catastrophe such moves would trigger, but Master Yoda counseled caution, sensing through the Force that Sidious had prepared for exposure and likely controlled more pieces of the board than anyone realized. The council debated while clone troopers sealed the temple against potential assault, and Jedi Knights mobilized to protect senators who might be targeted by Sith agents embedded throughout the government. But before they could agree on unified response, the infection launched its most devastating assault yet. Coordinated attacks struck a dozen core worlds simultaneously, infected vessels emerging from hyperspace to spread contamination through population centers with surgical precision. Coruscant itself came under siege as biological bombs detonated in the lower levels, releasing spores that began transforming the city planet's vast population with terrifying speed. The Jedi Temple became fortress under siege, its ancient walls proving inadequate against an enemy that spread through ventilation systems and water supplies that turned defenders into weapons against their own allies. Anakin fought through contaminated corridors alongside Obi-Wan and Ahsoka, his lightsaber cutting through infected civilians and clone troopers whose faces he recognized, each death another weight on his conscience. He could feel the infection's intelligence coordinating the assault, could sense through the Force that this represented more than random attack, but carefully planned strike designed to decapitate galactic resistance at its heart. And beneath the tactical assault, he sensed Sidious's presence orchestrating events, using the infection as weapon against enemies, while positioning himself to emerge as savior once the crisis peaked. The Temple's fall came not through overwhelming force but through internal betrayal. Several Jedi Knights, driven to despair by the seemingly hopeless conflict, had allowed themselves to become infected in hope that assimilation would end their suffering. These corrupted Force users opened sealed doors and disabled defensive protocols, allowing infection vectors to spread throughout the sacred structure. Master Yoda sensed the betrayal through the Force, but could not prevent its consequences, could only watch as centuries of accumulated wisdom and thousands of irreplaceable artifacts became contaminated by spreading biomatter. He ordered general evacuation, directing Jedi to escape through secret tunnels, while he and a handful of Masters made final stand in the council chamber, buying time with their lives for younger knights to carry the Order's legacy beyond Coruscant's fall. The last transmission from the Jedi Temple was Master Yoda's voice speaking calmly into the emergency frequency, his words carrying weight of 8 centuries spent in service to the Force. Survived, the Order has, through extinction and persecution across millennia. Survive this crisis we shall, though not in the form we have known. Remember what we taught, those who escape must. Remember that the Force flows through all living things, that balance requires both light and darkness, that even in defeat, hope remains. Ended, this is not. Only transformed into new beginning. The transmission cut off as explosions rippled through the temple's upper levels, ancient spires collapsing in clouds of dust and biomechanical debris. Across Coruscant, citizens looked up in horror as the symbol of Jedi authority crumbled. Its destruction broadcast across emergency channels, where Palpatine appeared moments later to declare martial law and proclaim the birth of the Galactic Empire. He blamed the Jedi for releasing the infection, claimed they had experimented with forbidden technology and arrogant belief they could control forces beyond their understanding, and announced that all surviving Jedi were to be hunted down and destroyed for crimes against the galaxy. The clone troopers received Order 66, embedded programming activating to turn them against the Jedi they had served beside for years, and across 1,000 battlefields, the slaughter began. The double extinction of Jedi Order and galactic civilization occurred simultaneously, each feeding the other's destruction. Anakin fled Coruscant aboard a stolen transport, carrying Padme and a handful of surviving younglings toward coordinates Obi-Wan had transmitted before disappearing into Coruscant's burning lower levels. The planet fell away beneath them, its surface covered in spreading biomatter that pulsed with sickly bioluminescence, its population already majority consumed by an infection that now controlled one of the galaxy's most populous worlds. Anakin felt through the Force the death of his order and the transformation of the Republic into something dark and terrible, felt Sidious's triumph resonating through the cosmic currents, and understood that everything he had fought to protect had been lost not through defeat in battle but through manipulation he had been too blind to recognize. Padme held his hand in silence, her presence the only anchor keeping him from drowning in despair, and the younglings huddled in the cargo hold, their innocent faces marked by trauma that would never fully heal. The galaxy was ending, and somehow life continued regardless. The resistance that formed in the war's aftermath consisted of scattered survivors clinging to existence in the spaces between Imperial control and infection spread. Jedi who had escaped Order 66 gathered in hidden enclaves, maintaining their traditions in secret while avoiding both Imperial hunters and contaminated worlds. Republic loyalists who rejected the Empire's authority established underground networks, coordinating sabotage and intelligence gathering despite impossible odds. Even some separatist forces, recognizing Sidious's betrayal, joined the resistance despite years of enmity, understanding that old grievances meant nothing in the face of dual threats consuming the galaxy. These disparate groups struggled to coordinate effective opposition, hampered by communication difficulties and the constant danger of infection spreading through their ranks, but they persisted through sheer stubborn refusal to accept extinction without resistance. And slowly, painfully, they began discovering the infection's true weakness. Jocasta knew, having escaped Coruscant's fall with fragments of the archives stored in portable holocrons, conducted research that revealed the infection's fundamental limitation. Despite its terrifying adaptive capabilities and vast distributed intelligence, it remained vulnerable to one force it could not understand or incorporate: genuine sacrifice made freely rather than extracted through assimilation. The infection consumed consciousness and folded it into collective awareness, but it could not comprehend the transcendent act of individuals choosing death to preserve others' freedom. This weakness existed in quantum mechanics of how the infection interfaced with the Force, a fundamental incompatibility between its assimilating nature and the cosmic energy that flowed through willing sacrifice. Jocasta's discovery suggested that coordinated strikes by Force users willing to die in the attempt could sever the infection's network at critical nexus points, disrupting its cohesion long enough for conventional weapons to destroy contaminated infrastructure. It was suicide mission writ large, requiring Jedi to embrace martyrdom on unprecedented scale, but it offered the first genuine hope of victory since the crisis began. Master Yoda, having survived the Temple's fall and gathered surviving Jedi to a hidden sanctuary beyond the Outer Rim, listened to Jocasta's proposal with ancient eyes that had witnessed too much tragedy. He understood immediately what she was suggesting, recognized that defeating the infection would require the Jedi to give everything, to sacrifice not just individual lives but potentially the Order itself in service of preserving the galaxy's freedom. It was the ultimate test of their principles. The question of whether they could embrace destruction to prevent greater destruction, whether the values they had upheld for millennia meant anything if preserving them required civilization's extinction. The assembled Jedi listened in silence as Yoda explained the stakes and the cost, watching their aged master struggle with decision that would define the Force's legacy for eons to come. A cost too terrible to calculate. "This sacrifice requires," Yoda said, his voice heavy with sorrow beyond words. "Our lives, our order, everything we have been, must be given freely. But preserve the galaxy's future. This gift will allow new generations to face their own destinies, unburdened by our failures and uncorrupted by the infection's hunger." One by one, the Jedi accepted the mission, understanding that this represented their final service to the ideals they had sworn to uphold. The assault on the infection's central nexus required coordination beyond anything the fractured resistance had previously achieved. Jedi Knights, clone deserters, separatist holdouts, and Imperial defectors worked together in careful planning, identifying the corrupted world that served as primary relay for the infection's distributed network. The planet had once been Korriban, ancient Sith homeworld, its dark side corruption making it ideal foundation for the infection's expansion. The intelligence had consumed the world's tombs and temples, folding Sith artifacts and dark side energy into its structure, creating hybrid entity that wielded both biological assimilation and force corruption with equal facility. Attacking Korriban meant confronting the worst aspects of both threats simultaneously, fighting through legions of infected warriors who could use the Force while navigating Sith temples designed to corrupt intruders through architectural design alone. It was suicide mission that made previous desperate operations look cautious by comparison. The assault fleet dropped from hyperspace above Korriban's scarred surface, a ragtag collection of Republic and Separatist vessels united by shared desperation. Anakin Skywalker led the Jedi contingent, his presence galvanizing the Force users who had survived this long through combination of skill and luck. Obi-Wan fought beside him, their bond restored through shared loss and common purpose. Ahsoka Tano coordinated with clone commanders who had removed their control chips and rejected Order 66, their loyalty to the Jedi overriding Sidious's programming. Even Count Dooku appeared, having abandoned the Sith in recognition that his master's schemes had brought the galaxy to extinction's edge, willing to give his life in attempt to undo some measure of the damage his choices had enabled. They descended toward Korriban's surface knowing few would return, accepting death as price of meaningful resistance. The battle that followed lasted 3 days and consumed thousands of lives, resistance forces throwing themselves against infection defenses with suicidal abandon. Jedi Knights fought through the Valley of the Dark Lords, their lightsabers cutting through infected Sith abominations that had been grown from ancient corpses and dark side energy. Clone troopers deployed experimental weapons Jocasta Nu had designed, based on Rakatan technology, devices that disrupted the infection's quantum coherence and severed its network connections. Separatist battle droids marched alongside their former enemies, their mechanical nature making them immune to biological contamination, even as the infection adapted to corrupt their programming through electromagnetic pulses. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, every meter of ground claimed through terrible sacrifice, every victory measured in bodies burned to ash rather than allow the infection to reclaim them. And through it all, the Force itself seemed to weaken, reality growing thin as the infection's nexus came under sustained assault. Anakin led the final push into Korriban's deepest temple, following coordinates Jocasta had calculated as the nexus point where the infection's network cohesion could be most effectively disrupted. He fought through corridors grown from biomatter and Sith stone, through chambers where infected Force users waited in ambush, their attacks coordinated with precision that suggested the intelligence directing them had learned everything the Jedi Order knew about combat. Behind him, Obi-Wan and Ahsoka defended their rear, their lightsabers weaving patterns of plasma that held back the tide of corruption trying to overwhelm them. They reached the temple's heart to find something that defied description, a vast chamber where the infection had grown a living cathedral from consumed bodies and dark side energy, where thousands of faces writhed in the walls and ceiling, their eyes tracking the intruders with terrible awareness. At the chamber's center, suspended in organic scaffolding that pulsed with bioluminescent veins, hung Master Yoda. The ancient Jedi had come ahead of the main Force, had surrendered himself to the infection in carefully calculated sacrifice designed to access its network from within. His body showed signs of partial assimilation, biomechanical growths erupting from his aged flesh, but his eyes remained clear, his consciousness intact through sheer force of will maintained across days of resistance against the infection's attempts to absorb him. When Anakin and his companions entered the chamber, Yoda spoke with voice layered by whispers but still recognizably his own. "Succeeded I have in understanding the infection's nature," he said, each word carrying immense effort. A fragment it is, of something vast beyond comprehension, separated from its origin and seeking reunion through assimilation of complexity. Not evil, is it, not in ways we understand, but incompatible with existence that values individuality and choice. Destroy it we must, but with understanding that we destroy not enemy but lost thing seeking home through the only means it knows. Anakin approached slowly, his lightsaber raised but not yet ignited, feeling through the Force, the terrible struggle occurring within Yoda's mind as the ancient master fought to maintain his identity against the infection's consuming hunger. Behind him, he heard Obi-Wan and Ahsoka engaging new waves of infected defenders, heard explosions as clone troopers deployed charges throughout the temple's supporting structures. The plan required precise timing, required Yoda to release his hold on life at the exact moment when the temple's destruction would sever the infection's network cohesion, allowing conventional weapons to burn away contaminated worlds before new central nexus could form. It required the death of the Jedi Order's greatest master in service of buying the galaxy one final chance at survival. "Tell me what I must do," Anakin said, his voice breaking despite Jedi training that should have granted emotional control. Yoda's eyes focused on him with terrible clarity, ancient wisdom shining through even the infection's corruption. "Strike true you must, when I release my hold. No hesitation, no mercy. My death will ripple through the network, will carry disruption to every infected world simultaneously. In that moment of chaos, the Resistance's weapons must fire, must burn away contamination before adaptation can occur. Miss this chance we cannot, for another will not come." Anakin ignited his lightsaber, blue plasma casting harsh light across the chamber's biomechanical horrors, and raised the blade above Yoda's transformed body. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to find another way, but 8 centuries of wisdom looked at him from Yoda's eyes, and he understood that this moment represented the culmination of everything the Jedi had been, the final expression of their commitment to serving life even unto their own extinction. He felt Obi-Wan and Ahsoka join him, felt their presence in the Force adding strength to his resolution, and together they prepared to commit the act that would either save or doom the galaxy. "Now," Yoda whispered, and released his grip on life with serenity that transcended flesh and fear. Anakin's lightsaber fell in arc of blue fire, cutting through the biomechanical connections that bound Yoda to the infection's network. The ancient master's body convulsed once, his face achieving expression of profound peace before going still, and in that instant, the Force itself shuddered, reality rippling as Yoda's consciousness, rather than being absorbed into the infection's collective awareness, exploded outward through the network like antimatter detonating in negative space. His life force, given freely and completely, proved toxic to the infection's assimilating nature, carrying disruption through quantum channels that connected every contaminated world in cascading wave of destructive feedback. Across the galaxy, central nexuses collapsed, the infection's coordinated intelligence fragmenting into millions of isolated clusters that could no longer adapt or coordinate responses. The signal went out across all resistance channels. Fire. Burn everything. Now, orbital weapons platforms that had been carefully positioned above infected worlds opened fire with every weapon they possessed. Conventional explosives and experimental plasma, nuclear devices and focused electromagnetic pulses, ancient Rakatan disintegrators and modern Republic innovations, all deployed simultaneously in coordinated strike that had been planned to the second. Infected worlds burned beneath cleansing fire, their atmospheres igniting as contaminated biomatter proved vulnerable to sustained thermal attack. The destruction was absolute and terrible, billions dead, entire civilizations erased, hundreds of worlds reduced to ash and molten stone. It was genocide on scale that would haunt survivor dreams for generations, atrocity committed in name of preservation, Darkness embraced to prevent greater darkness, and when the fires finally died, when the last contaminated world had been sterilized and the last infection vector burned from space, the galaxy fell silent. The resistance forces that survived retreated to hidden sanctuaries, too few to celebrate victory that felt more like defeat, too traumatized to do anything but exist in aftermath of apocalypse. Anakin stood on the bridge of the last functioning Republic cruiser, looking through viewports at a galaxy transformed by fire and death, and wondered what they had saved. The Empire still controlled the core worlds. Darth Sidious still sat on his throne proclaiming authority over systems that could no longer communicate or trade. The Jedi Order had been reduced to fewer than 50 survivors scattered across hostile territory. The civilization that had endured for thousands of years lay in ruins, its population decimated, its infrastructure destroyed, its future uncertain beyond all previous imagining. But the infection was dead, its distributed consciousness shattered beyond recovery, its threat eliminated through sacrifice that would echo through Force legends for eons. Master Yoda became one with the Force as the galaxy burned, his spirit ascending to join the cosmic current while his body crumbled to ash in Korriban's collapsing temple. Jedi, across known space, felt his passing like wound in reality itself, the loss of anchor that had maintained the Order's course for 8 centuries. Some wept openly, others retreated into meditation seeking guidance that would never come again, all understanding that they stood at threshold between ages, survivors of catastrophe tasked with building new order from fragments of the old. Obi-Wan Kenobi took up the burden of leadership despite feeling inadequate to the task, gathering the scattered Jedi to a remote world where they could heal and plan in secret. Anakin Skywalker chose different path, taking Padme and their newborn twins into hiding on Tatooine, abandoning the Jedi entirely in favor of protecting the small family that represented his entire universe. The Order fractured without Yoda's wisdom to bind it, each survivor choosing their own path forward in galaxy that no longer recognized their authority or welcomed their presence. In the years that followed, legends spread through survivor populations about the plague that had nearly consumed the galaxy, about the Jedi who sacrificed everything to stop it, about the price of survival when extinction became alternative. Some stories painted the infection as divine punishment for civilization's hubris, others as cosmic test that revealed both the worst and best of sentient nature. Children born after the burning grew up among ruins, their worlds rebuilding slowly from ashes, and they asked their elders why the old civilization fell so completely, why the Guardians failed to protect them, why the galaxy had allowed such devastation to occur. The elders had no good answers, could only gesture toward ruined temple complexes and silent worlds, could only whisper that sometimes the price of survival exceeded calculation and the choice between death and corruption admitted no compromise. The galaxy healed slowly, grew cautiously, rebuilt with knowledge that paradise could end overnight and eternal truths could shatter against existential threat. Darth Sidious maintained his empire through the chaos, using the crisis's aftermath to consolidate absolute control over systems too broken to resist his authority. He hunted the surviving Jedi with mechanical efficiency, turning them into cautionary examples and propaganda tools that justified his authoritarian rule. But even he recognized that the infection had come within heartbeats of consuming everything, that his carefully cultivated plans had nearly become irrelevant in face of threat he had failed to anticipate or control. The experience humbled him in ways nothing else could have, forced him to acknowledge that the dark side's power remained subject to forces beyond Sith understanding, that the galaxy contained horrors older than his ambitions. He turned his focus toward consolidating existing power rather than expanding further, building fortress rather than empire, maintaining control over what remained rather than risking everything for conquest. The emperor who emerged from the burning years was darker and more paranoid than the chancellor who had orchestrated the Clone Wars. his rule defined by fear of threats both external and internal. On Tatooine, Anakin Skywalker raised his children in peace that felt hollow after everything he had witnessed. He taught them to honor the memory of the Jedi without embracing the Order's restrictions, to value life without pretending its preservation came without cost, to understand that the galaxy contained both transcendent beauty and incomprehensible horror. Luke and Leia grew strong in the Force, their potential enormous, but Anakin refused to train them as Jedi, knowing that path led only to sacrifice and extinction. He watched twin suns set over Tatooine's endless dunes and thought of Master Yoda's final moments, of Obi-Wan's decision to continue fighting despite hopeless odds, of all the choices that had led from Republic glory to Empire ashes, and he wondered if perhaps the galaxy had needed to burn, if perhaps the old Order's destruction represented necessary precondition for something better to emerge. But those were thoughts for sleepless nights, not for days filled with twin laughter and Padmé's quiet strength. The Force remained, flowing through all living things despite the galaxy's trauma, maintaining balance through methods that defied mortal understanding. In hidden sanctuaries and forgotten temples, in survivor hearts and rebuilt communities, the light persisted against the dark. Life reasserted itself against entropy's patient hunger. The Jedi Order as it had been was dead, destroyed by combination of Sith conspiracy and existential threat, but the ideals they had represented endured in scattered form, carried by individuals who remembered that peace required vigilance and freedom demanded sacrifice. These guardians had no temple, no council, no official authority, but they moved through the galaxy's shadows, offering aid where they could, fighting injustice where they found it, maintaining hope that someday the wounds would heal and civilization could rebuild according to wisdom earned through suffering. They were remnants and refugees, survivors of apocalypse, but they carried forward the light. Years became decades, and slowly the burning faded into history, its events transformed into legends that parents told children as cautionary tales. The infected worlds remained quarantined, their surfaces rendered permanently hostile to complex life, serving as tombstones for billions consumed. The Empire maintained strict controls over information about the crisis, suppressing records and eliminating witnesses who might challenge official narratives that blamed everything on Jedi arrogance. But truth persisted in underground networks and survivor testimonies, in fragmentary records and memorial services held in secret, in the shared trauma that bound an entire generation regardless of faction or ideology. Those who had fought through the burning years carried scars, both physical and spiritual, marks that never fully healed, nightmares that woke them screaming decades after the threat ended. They had seen the galaxy nearly die and survived its resurrection, and that knowledge changed them fundamentally. In the end, the question of whether the sacrifice was justified remained unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, subject to perspective and interpretation that varied based on who asked and when. The Jedi who died gave everything, believing their sacrifice preserved freedom and individuality, values they considered worth defending even unto extinction. The civilizations that burned suffered losses that could never be repaid or rationalized away, horror that transcended any strategic necessity. The survivors inherited galaxy transformed by fire, scarred by choices made in desperate moments when extinction seemed inevitable. None could say with certainty whether alternative approaches might have achieved better outcomes, whether the cost paid was minimum necessary or wasteful excess born of panic and insufficient imagination. The Force itself offered no judgment, merely continued flowing through reality's fabric, maintaining balance according to principles beyond mortal comprehension. But perhaps that uncertainty represented the lesson, the essential truth the infection forced the galaxy to confront. Existence contained no guarantees, no prophecies that always fulfilled, no authorities who could promise safety without cost. Every choice extracted price, Every path forward required sacrifice of alternatives. Every survival demanded payment in blood and tears, and abandoned principles. The galaxy had learned through fire that eternal vigilance was not mere platitude but fundamental requirement for preventing extinction, that the price of existence was constant struggle against entropy in all its forms. The Jedi and their enemies, the Republic and its corruption, the infection and its hunger, all represented different aspects of the eternal conflict between complexity and simplification, between individual consciousness and collective uniformity. And in that conflict, there could be no final victory, only continued resistance and persistent hope. The story of the Flood's incursion into the Star Wars galaxy became myth over subsequent generations, its details elaborated and distorted through retelling until truth became indistinguishable from legend. Some versions painted the Jedi as martyrs who saved civilization through ultimate sacrifice. Others portrayed them as arrogant fools whose failures created the crisis they died trying to resolve. Still others suggested the infection never truly died but merely hibernated, waiting in contaminated ruins for opportunity to resume its spread. These competing narratives reflected the galaxy's ongoing struggle to process trauma that had shattered every certainty and revealed civilization's fundamental fragility. But beneath the variations and embellishments, the core truth persisted. The galaxy had faced extinction and survived through choices that haunted everyone who made them, through costs that could never be fully paid or justified. And that truth, more than any tactical detail or philosophical debate, defined the legacy of the burning years. On remote world, far from trade routes and imperial authority, Obi-Wan Kenobi meditated in simple dwelling carved from desert stone, feeling through the Force toward future he would never see. He sensed his former apprentices' twins growing strong on Tatooine, their potential suggesting they might restore what had been lost or transcend it entirely. He felt scattered Jedi maintaining their vigil across the galaxy, carrying forward the light, despite having no temple or council to coordinate their efforts. And in the deepest currents of the Force itself, he touched echoes of Master Yoda's final sacrifice, the ripples of that choice spreading forward through time in ways that would shape events for generations. The old Jedi smiled despite his sorrow, understanding that the story was not finished, that new chapters awaited writing by heroes not yet born, that the galaxy's capacity for renewal exceeded its talent for destruction. The Force would find balance as it always did, through means both terrible and beautiful, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, in void where light feared to tread, fragments of the infection drifted in frozen hibernation, patient and waiting, because extinction proved remarkably difficult to achieve with absolute certainty. But that was problem for future generations, challenge for heroes not yet tested by fire, crisis that would demand its own sacrifices and hard choices. For now, the galaxy breathed, healed, and slowly rebuilt, carrying forward both the scars and the lessons of its closest brush with final silence. The twin suns continued burning, indifferent witnesses to the rise and fall of civilizations, and life persisted in all its terrible glory.